Can a perceived loss of dignity and control lead a seemingly upright man to execute two high-profile political assassinations in the seat of government? How does a decorated former police officer and firefighter, a man considered a dedicated traditional public servant, transition into a double murder in the span of one cold morning in San Francisco's City Hall? Welcome. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the Dan White case. I will be focusing on the main mental health and psychological indicators while providing the backstory. I don't just talk about the crimes, I talk about the psychology behind the crimes and the mysteries that captivate us. I look beyond the facts of the case to understand the why of the crime. My analysis is based on my speculations, as not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. What is the significance of a person who has always been highly disciplined suddenly abandoning their core healthy habits? The first compelling behavioral clue in the Dan White case is his radical shift from his established rigid structure. Dan White was, by all accounts, a man who built his entire self-worth on structure, discipline, and the physical competence. This pattern suggests a deep-seated psychological need for order and external validation through performance. However, in the months leading up to the events of November 27, 1978, the health-conscious White and known fitness fanatic who prided himself on his diet began consuming excessive amounts of sugary junk food and soft drinks, abandoning his healthy routine. He stopped exercising, showed signs of insomnia, and became noticeably slobby in appearance, withdrawing from his wife. The first psychological red flag here is a precipitous shift from an ordered, healthy lifestyle to an extreme self-neglect and unhealthy indulgence. In a clinical context, this dramatic change is a powerful symptom of severe, untreated depression and signals a profound internal crisis. This was coupled with an intense financial strain. He was elected in 1977 to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors to represent the conservative District 8, but the $9,600 annual salary was insufficient to support his wife and newborn child. The financial pressure, combined with a sense of political isolation on the liberal board, intensified his underlying mental health decline. On November 10, 1978, White resigned from his seat on the Board of Supervisors, publicly citing the financial burden. Psychologically, this action was an attempt to resolve a conflict, but it ultimately compounded his feelings of helplessness. He immediately regretted the resignation, realizing he had forfeited his social status, his political platform, and his sense of purpose. The resignation stripped him of his public identity, leaving the depressed man with a severe case of political and personal failure. He spent the next 2 weeks desperately lobbying the mayor for a reappointment. This effort was critical to his psychological equilibrium. Reappointment would have restored his dignity and self-control. How does a perceived betrayal, particularly in a politically charged environment, become the trigger for a catastrophic violence in an already emotionally volatile individual? White viewed his political rival, Supervisor Harvey Milk, as a major obstacle, believing Milk was actively lobbying the mayor against his reappointment. Milk, as the city's first openly gay elective official, was the symbolic and political opposite of the traditional conservative White. On the morning of November 27, 1978, White went to the City Hall, armed with a .38 caliber revolver and 10 rounds of ammunition, hoping to secure his job back. When the mayor confirmed he would not reinstate White, the final door to restoring his life and identity was slammed shut. The second psychological red flag is a conflation of political rejection with total personal invalidation. For White, the denial of an appointment was not just a job loss. It represented the total collapse of his public identity, his future, triggering a catastrophic loss of perceived control. The sequence of events on that morning reveals a critical psychological component, premeditation coexisting with emotional volatility. White bypassed the metal detectors by climbing through the basement window, a calculated act that utilized his knowledge of a former police officer to evade security. This is not the spontaneous action of a person who simply snapped in a moment of pure passion. What is the psychological difference between a crime of passion and a calculated multi-victim assassination? And how does the reloading of a weapon change the analysis? White first confronted the mayor in his office. After a brief final discussion, White shot the mayor twice in the chest and twice in the head. While the first shots may have been attributed to a sudden surge of rage, the latter two shots delivered to the head of the incapacitated mayor suggest a deliberate intent to ensure death, an act that moves beyond impulsive rage into cold execution. The third psychological red flag is the entry into the crime scene, City Hall, and the targeted executional style shots. This shows a high degree of premeditation and a clear operational intent to commit violence while attempting to evade immediate detection. The most compelling piece of psychological evidence for the planning is what happened next. White rapidly reloaded his revolver with additional ammunition, specifically using hollow point bullets. This conscious, deliberate action, reloading between the two murders, interrupted any claim of complete mental break or automatic pilot state. Reloading requires focus and clear intent, suggesting White had the capacity to continue his deadly plan. White then moved quickly down the hall to the office of Supervisor Milk. Does choosing a second victim who is an ideological and political rival indicate a swift form of personal grievance to a broader, perhaps unconscious targeting of a perceived opposition? The second murder was much different. It was not just about the job. It was about the destruction of the perceived political and ideological enemy he blamed for his failures. Harvey Milk represented the liberal change in San Francisco that White felt was marginalizing the city's traditional working class, people like himself. White shot Milk 5 times, with the final 2 shots again being delivered as Milk laid on the floor. The fourth psychological red flag, the systematic elimination of both the source of rejection, the mayor, and the symbol of ideological opposition, Milk. This indicates the violence was driven by both personal grievance and a broader destructive impulse against perceived political enemies. How does the concept of doubling down on a violent act by immediately seeking a second victim reveal a deeper unaddressed pattern of retaliatory thinking? The decision to target Milk immediately after the mayor demonstrates a destructive retaliatory pattern. The mayor was the source of the political rejection, but Milk was the source of the grievance and the symbol of White's perceived political displacement. The fifth psychological red flag is a deliberate, conscious act of reloading the weapon between the 2 murders. This key piece of evidence fundamentally undermines the pure crime of passion argument and suggests a capacity for sustained, focused, goal-directed violence. At his trial, the prosecution sought the first-degree murder conviction. The defense, however, presented the now infamous diminished capacity defense. If a person exhibits multiple symptoms of clinical depression, can a jury be convinced that these symptoms prevented them from forming the necessary criminal intent for murder? Forensic psychiatrists testified that White was suffering from a severe episode of clinical depression at the time of the murders. They argued that this depression had so impaired his judgment and rational thought that he was unable to premeditate the killings, which is a requirement for first-degree murder. This is where the media-coined Twinkie defense originated. The psychiatrist, Dr. Martin Blinder, introduced White's junk food consumption, the Twinkies, Coca-Cola, and other sugary snacks, not as the cause of violence, but as a key symptom of underlying debilitating depression. The sixth psychological red flag is a successful use of severe untreated depression to argue diminished capacity for premeditation. This legal outcome highlights the real-world clinical impact of White's mental health state on his legal culpability. The jury ultimately accepted this defense, convicting White of the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter on May 21, 1979. He was sentenced to 7 years and 8 months. The verdict itself had a massive destabilizing psychological impact on the city, leading to the White Night riots. For the LGBTQ community and liberal activists, the manslaughter verdict felt like a deep institutional injustice, reinforcing a profound sense of vulnerability and marginalization. How does the inability to reintegrate into society after a highly publicized crime indicate that the underlying psychological pathology remains unaddressed? White was paroled on January 7, 1984, serving just over 5 years. The public outrage had not subsided. The city that was once his home and the source of his pride now viewed him with absolute hatred. Psychologically, his return to society was a brutal continuation of the rejection and isolation that initially fueled his breakdown. The loss of his career, status, and family life, all consequences of his own actions. It created an environment where recovery was nearly impossible. The psychological red flag number 7 is the extreme isolation and an inability to reintegrate following release. White's forced displacement and the public's continued hostility confirm his lack of social belonging, which was a core psychological stressor before the crime. Less than 2 years after his release on October 21, 1985, Dan White died by suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage. He was just 39 years old. What does the final act of suicide, long after the immediate crisis has passed, reveal about the long-term unaddressed psychological distress of a perpetrator? The suicide provides the final tragic piece of evidence that the severe depression and profound sense of failure that his defense argued had diminished his capacity for murder were in fact chronic and ultimately fatal conditions. He was unable to escape the external consequences or the internal psychological toll of his actions. The final and 8th psychological red flag is that suicide is the ultimate act of self-destruction and evidence of chronic unresolved psychological suffering. This final act confirms that the underlying mental health crisis was never truly treated or resolved, despite his release from prison. The Dan White case remains a complex and sad study in the psychology of rage, failure, and the devastating consequences of untreated depression. This is a very sad case where Dan White appeared to have a lot of success in the community. His political career was going well, his career in law enforcement. He was a public servant. He loved his town, his city, and he really found a lot of value in self-worth in what he did. And that's part of the problem. When someone focuses so much on what they do as a part of their identity, that becomes an obsession. And when that part, whether it's a job or a political assignment, if that goes away, it can really diminish your mental capacity. And unfortunately for Dan, his capacity was very, very limited. And he was depressed. He was angry. He was hurt. All these things. He lost his identity. And so he felt in that moment, the only way out was revenge. And unfortunately, the families of both the mayor of Milk, they lost a loved one. And unfortunately, Dan and his family lost him as well. And then it created this trauma, this fear in the community of political, you're on that side or I'm on this side. And if you're over there, I'm going to be against you. It started to create this identity in their political environment, what they believed in. And that can really erode a community. And there's so many layers about this case that's tragic. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this is because this underlying deep-seated depression that Dan was facing never got treated. It was untreated. And not that everybody who's depressed will go out and commit a crime like this, but it's to highlight that if you're struggling with depression, get some help. Don't be ashamed of reaching out for help if you're depressed. So what did you think about this case? Were there any elements that stood out to you? If you want more mental health analysis of true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe for more. And if you found this case compelling, be sure to watch this next story. It will make you more aware of your surroundings. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.